Okay, so what I will do now is I'm going to focus specifically on this period, okay, when Cyrus conquered Babylon and released the Jews to return to Jerusalem. Because this marks a fundamental shift in the religion. At this point, what will happen is the merger of the Persian religion with the Israelite religion, which creates a new religion. Okay? Now, the religion of the Persians is called Zoroastrianism. All right? And the merger of these two religions will become the basis of a new religion that will come to dominate the world called Christianity. All right? Okay. So, to understand this history, I will have to first talk about the history of Mesopotamia, okay? So, as we discussed in class, the history of Mesopotamia is one of violent struggle because there are many violent people in this area, and this area is the center of the world, basically. It's where all the trade goes through. It's very wealthy. It's very multi-ethnic and multinational. So conflict and violence arises all the time. Okay? So you have over here a place called Arabia. And Arabia are nomadic people. Okay? And over here you have something called the Zagros Mountains. Up here is Anatolia, which is also very wealthy. And over here are the two rivers, okay? The Euphrates and the Tigris. And the city-states are built along the two rivers. The nomadic people in the desert of Arabia and the mountains of Zagros are opportunistic, okay? They will trade with you, but they will also raid you and steal from you. Okay? They'll constantly be raiding and trading with these city-states. What keeps them in check is these city-states have walls. Okay? As well, these city-states will fight each other for dominance. Okay? Because in Mesopotamia, the religion is people must fight for the honor and glory of their patron god. What keeps the city-states from destroying each other is they believe that each city-state, in each city-state in a temple lives a great god. So you can destroy the enemy's army in the battlefield, but you can't go and ransack the city and the temple because that would incur the wrath of the god. Okay? So there are these religious taboos that keep the system in check. And so for centuries, they've been fighting each other and struggling against each other. And in this process of struggle, they will create many tremendous innovations that will forever change human history. For example, they create writing. They create many forms of knowledge, like mathematics and astronomy. Okay? So this is considered the cradle of civilization. This system broke down when a king named Luga Zaghazi, okay, of a city-state called Umma, okay, and Umma is always in conflict with a city-state called Lagash. And Luga Zaghazi, he is so ambitious that he's willing to defy the gods. He decides, this is stupid. I keep on attacking my enemy, but I have to retreat after I win because I'm afraid of offending their god. Well, I'm going to test their god. I'm going to go into Lagash, destroy the temple, steal all their wealth so I can fund other military adventures and see if their god will seek revenge. Okay? So he's breaking the taboo. It's basically like the equivalent of using a nuclear weapon today. Okay? So he goes to Lagash and destroys Lagash, burns down the temple, steals all their wealth, and nothing happens. In fact, he becomes even more successful. And he goes around and starts slowly conquering the city-states of Mesopotamia, of Sumer, And he's about to unite all the entire region. And now the city-states are unified in their hatred of this person. He has defiled their temples. He has mocked their gods. Okay? This creates an opportunity for another warlord named Sargon of Akkad. And Sargon of Akkad is determined to destroy Lugal-Zagesi and restore the honor and glory of the gods of Mesopotamia. Why is he doing this? Because he himself has a legitimacy problem. Okay? He was a mercenary, and he was part of the city-state of Kish. Okay? So he was supposed to be loyal to the king of Kish, but he was an extremely ambitious and charismatic soldier, so he did what David did, and he usurped the throne. And so now this creates a legitimacy problem. Because remember, in this religion, kings are descended from the gods. So now you, by usurping the throne, have offended the gods. So Sargon, his name means legitimate king, by the way. Okay? Legitimate king. Which tells us no one thought he was illegitimate, okay? He decides that he will create legitimacy by destroying Lugal-Zagesi. And he does that, okay? He destroys Lugal-Zagesi. He captures him, parades him around, and then kills him to show that he is favored by the gods. And by doing this, Sargon of Akkad unifies all of Mesopotamia, and he creates the first world empire called the Akkadian Empire. Okay? But also by doing this, okay, by creating the first empire, Sargon of Akkad will now unleash a cycle of violence. Okay? And so, over time, everyone will be forced to become more violent in order to maintain balance. It becomes an arms race of fear, terror, and violence. And empires rise and fall all the time. Okay? Again, the problem with this area is you have extremely aggressive nations, and there are no natural boundaries to protect you. So even though it's very easy for you to build an empire, it's also very easy for you to lose the empire. Okay? By 600 BCE, there are three major powers in this region. Okay? Over here in Anatolia, people call the Lydian, the Lydians. Okay? The Lydians. Over here in Mesopotamia, people will call the Babylonians. And over here, okay, are the Medians. And these are three superpowers that check and balance each other out. They're powerful, but they're not powerful enough to destroy each other. Okay? Around this time will emerge a new power center called the Persians. They are led by a great king named Cyrus the Great. Okay? He is considered to be the greatest ruler in human history. Alexander the Great saw him as a role model. When Alexander the Great invaded Persia, and he saw that the tomb of Cyrus the Great had been desecrated or abandoned, he was furious, and he stopped his campaign to make sure the tomb was renovated and returned to its former glory. If you go to Iran today, you can still visit the tomb of Cyrus the Great. Because throughout history, everyone had a high opinion of him, okay? Even the Greeks thought he was fabulous. His own people, of course, loved him. So for the longest time before Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, he was considered the greatest ruler in human history. Okay? So, but the problem is, because we don't have access to their writing, we know very little about him, okay? Here's what we do know about him. He was in charge, he was king of a local people called the Persians, who, of course, are descended from the Yamnaya, Okay? So they use horse archers in their warfare. Over time, he's able to conquer the Medians. King Croesus of the Lydians saw this as an opportunity to conquer the Medians as well. So he attacks. But Cyrus the Great defeats him. Okay? So now Cyrus the Great is in charge of 2 empires. What he does next is revolutionary in Mesopotamia. Instead of parading them around, like the captured kings around, and executing them like Sargon of Akkad, Cyrus the Great decides to make them advisors to his court. He shows mercy. He shows clemency. He shows forgiveness. And this shocks and awes the people of Mesopotamia. It shows Cyrus the Great is confident, is powerful, and is favored by the gods because he is willing to show mercy to his enemies. But not only that, what happens next is really interesting. The Babylonian Empire is the last empire in Mesopotamia. Okay? If Cyrus the Great wants to unify Mesopotamia, he has to conquer the Babylonians. At this time, the Babylonians have an internal conflict. The king and the nobility aren't getting along. The king wants to change the official god of Babylon from Marduk to Sin, because the king wants to establish his own religious authority. So this creates tremendous conflict eternally in Babylon. And normally, they would go to civil war. And normally, when they hear that Cyrus the Great has conquered the Medians and the Lydians, then they would think they have to unify in order to defeat Cyrus the Great. But they hear that Cyrus the Great, he's merciful, and he's generous, and he's wise. So what they do is the nobility strikes a deal with Cyrus the Great. And Cyrus the Great conquers Babylonia without doing anything. And in the official history of Cyrus the Great, he claims that the conquest of Babylonia was the greatest conquest, was his greatest conquest, because he did it through his generosity and his mercy, as opposed to killing lots and lots of people. Okay? And at this time, what Cyrus the Great and the Persians realize is, if you really want to control people, you have to use a policy called divide and rule. And the idea is this. Before these empires, the Akkadians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, they believed they had to use violence and fear to control people. But when you do that, all you do is you anger people, unite them, and force them to rebel against you. Okay? But if you recognize that in each society there are these natural factions who are in conflict with each other, and you're able to balance these factions, then they're relying on you for stability. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, this is what we call divide and rule. So the Persians created not an empire, but what we call a federation. In other words, a federation is the idea that people choose to be part of this federation because it benefits them. Okay, why does it benefit them? Because, first of all, it brings peace. If there's a conflict, you don't fight each other, you go to the Persians for a conflict resolution, okay? So it brings peace. Second of all, it brings prosperity through trade, okay? So the Persians create all these roads that enable trade within the empire. And so you're better off actually trading than you are fighting. Okay? And third of all, you're able to access new knowledge and culture through this process. So the Persians were the first to create a national imperial postal system. It was very, very clever. So all they did was they set up checkpoints throughout the empire. And these checkpoints, they were like hotels for postmen. They had food, they had new clothing, they had a place to sleep. And these postmen would on their horses carrying mail throughout the empire and stop at these checkpoints to rest. Okay? So the Persians showed that by participating in this empire, you could benefit a lot more than if you didn't participate, and therefore you should participate. And so it's an amazing achievement because remember, these nations were at war with each other throughout their history. And these are very aggressive people with lots of religious differences. And Cyrus the Great and his descendants were able to create a system that allowed them to work together and prosper together. And that's why he is remembered today, Cyrus the Great is remembered today as the greatest ruler of all time, okay, in human history. No one comes second. And also, why the Jews refer to him as Messiah, the God's chosen, God's anointed, a man picked by God to come to save the human people, the human race. So with this federation, with this empire, what's important is the idea of administration. Okay? Administration. You need administrators who will be conscientious and loyal and good people, okay? Because remember, they are working with local governors. So each region is allowed local autonomy, and each governor is called a satrap. So they are working with the satraps to govern the local area. And remember, these satraps are allowed maximum autonomy and freedom to do what they believe. Everyone's allowed to practice their own religion. Okay? So what the administrators are doing is ensuring divide and rule, right? That there's enough internal conflict within this region so that they're all dependent on the empire for guidance and authority. These administrators have to be, they can't get into like bed with the satraps. They can't be corrupt together, okay? Because the system will break down. So there had to be a system to keep the administrators loyal to the empire. And this system is a religion called Zoroastrianism. Okay? Zoroastrianism. And this is the religion of the Persian people. And this is the religion of the imperial administration. If you want to be a bureaucrat within this system, you have to believe in Zoroastrianism. You have to participate in the rituals and the rites of Zoroastrianism. And what made the system work is Zoroastrianism was at this time, 600 BCE, 500 BCE, the best religion in the world. Okay, so this is a new concept for us, the best religion in the world. We've discussed the best military in the world, right? The best military in the world has 3 characteristics. Discipline, they fight a lot. They have a lot of experience. Cohesion, they like each other, they get along. And devotion, they have a common purpose, they have a great leader that they love. Okay? It turns out religions can also be measured. And there are certain religions that are better than other religions based on 3 criteria. Okay? These 3 criteria are grandness, completeness, and unity. Okay? Grandness, completeness, and unity. And this is not a hard concept. So think of religion as a story and ask yourself, what makes a good story? What makes a story so wonderful you want to hear it? And it's these 3 things. Grandness, it's a big topic. Kings and gods and wars and love, okay? Completeness, there's a beginning and there's an end. And unity, there's a plot. Things are united, okay? So if I were to tell you a story about Gilgamesh, who's a king who fought these gods in a search for immortality, and in the end he discovers immortality is impossible, well, that's a complete, unified, and grand story. And you would want to hear that story. But if I would tell you a story about a guy named Robert who wants to get A's in school, and so he studies all the time, you don't want to hear the story, okay? It's not grand, it's very boring, it's not complete, there's no ending. It's not really unified because something really happens. Okay? Does that make sense? It's the same with religions. And the problem with most religions is the structure, okay? So the typical religion is a three-tier structure. So at the center are gods. And gods are the ones who participate in human affairs. They're the ones manipulating us. But there's also a higher tier that governs the gods as well, okay? These are cosmic forces like fate and fortune. And then the highest tier are these invisible laws of the universe that give it structure, okay? What is referred to as the immutable and unwritten laws of the cosmos. Okay, and this is what the Greeks believed. This is what the Romans believed. Okay? And as you can see, this system, it's not complete, it's not unified. Okay? It may be grand, but it's not complete or unified. It's a very loose system. Zoroastrianism is the first really grand, complete, and unified religion. Okay, so let's talk about Zoroastrianism. So, in the religion, they believe there is a creator, God, okay, called the Ahura Mazda, and he is the God of creation. He's the God of light. He's the God of order, and he creates a perfect world, perfection. And within this world, we humans are created, okay? But then there is an evil presence, an evil God, which comes and corrupts the perfection. And this evil, or darkness, is a match for the creator God, okay? So the world is a perfect balance of dark and light. What tips the balance is the human race. We have free will. Therefore, we can choose to fight for goodness or to fight for darkness, to fight for the truth or to fight for the lie, okay? So the two main, the economy is truth and lie. If you fight for the truth, you're making the world a better place. But if you fight for the lie, you are corrupting the world. Okay, so that's our choice. Eventually, a savior, a hero, will arise to prepare for the final battle between dark and light. In this final battle, light will triumph. Once light triumphs, a river will emerge. Okay, a river will emerge. And everyone must cross this river. Everyone will arise from the dead, and everyone has to cross the river. If you have been good, if you have fought for the truth, you will cross this river, and it will cleanse you. You will feel purified. You will become an eternal soul who will live in paradise forever. Will return to perfection, okay? But if in your life you have lived a lie, if you have committed evil, if you have done wrong against other people, then you will burn in the river and you will be condemned to hell for the rest of your life. Okay? And this is the idea, what we call eschatology. Eschatology. Yeah, okay, so this is a hard word, eschatology, but I need you guys to remember it because it's a very important word. Eschatology means an understanding of how the world ends. And Zoroastrianism is the first eschatological religion. It has an ending, a final battle, good versus evil, where everyone will be judged. Okay? And so now we understand why the Persian system works. Because if you are to be an administrator, if you are to work for the empire, and you believe in Zoroastrianism, then you have a duty to fight for the truth. Okay? We're here at most for 60, 80 years. And what we do in these 60, 80 years will decide how we live our lives for all of eternity. Okay? We either live in paradise or we will burn in hell, depending on how we perform these 60 to 80 years. So the Persians are under tremendous pressure to be a good person. And this is radical in the history of humanity. Okay? So remember, the Mesopotamians believe you are good if you achieve, right? How do you know you're good? Because you've achieved a lot. And by achieving a lot, you show that God's favor you. And the Egyptians believed in status. And others believed in just good luck, okay? But the Persians believed you have to be a good person. You have to show generosity, compassion, and mercy to others, as exemplified by the life and works and words of Cyrus the Great. Okay. So that's Zoroastrianism. And this is so powerful that it will be adopted into Judaism and eventually become the basis for Christianity. Okay? But this is where it started, Zoroastrianism. Any questions so far before I continue? Are you guys clear about what's happening?
Yeah, like, if this is the best religion, then what's the worst ones?
Okay, that's a good question. If this is the best religion, what are the worst ones? Okay, you're right. There's really no bad religion, okay? But the most common religion is folklore religions, right? So you live in a village and you believe in a local god. Okay, does that make sense? And so when I say it's best, what I mean is intellectually it's the best. It's a religion that can attract the best and the brightest. Do you understand? It's a religion where if you are a very intelligent person, you are attracted to this religion. Okay, does that make sense? But if you are just a normal person, you're just going to believe what your father and your grandfather believed. Okay? So think of this religion almost as the equivalent of the Confucian classics in China. How do you show cultivation in China? By reading the Confucian classics. And if you want to become a scholar official, you have to memorize the Confucian classics, right? The same concept here, where Zoroastrianism, you have to believe in this religion if you want to become an administrator. And the problem with this religion that makes it hard for people to understand is it's very abstract. Okay? That's the main failing of this religion. It's very abstract. It's very intellectual. And that's why a lot of people don't really see this as a religion and more as a philosophy. And what's also important for us to understand is the abstraction is what makes this religion appealing, right? Because the Persians are trying to attract the best and brightest for their administration. So they don't want a popular religion. They're not trying to promote their religion. Okay? They're trying to use their religion to filter out the best and the brightest. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay? So you're right. I can't say this is the best religion, but it's the religion that is the most intellectual and which will attract the best administrators in the Persian Empire. And that's why it's effective. Okay? Great question. Okay, any more questions? Yes.
One is that, like the religion explains where do people come from or where do they go?
Okay, so the idea of completeness is eschatology, okay? An ending. Because most religions don't actually have an ending. They're not like, okay, this is when the world ends. Okay, so for example, King David, the Bible, right? It's telling us that King David is really the end of history. And from now on, we will live forever in this Davidic kingdom. Okay? This is the best we can do. But it's not saying, okay, King David, we will eventually reach a point when the world ends and when God returns to the earth. No religion is doing that before Zoroastrianism. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay? So think of completeness as a circle, right? Because if you look at Zoroastrianism, they say this is a perfection, right? But now there's corruption. So the story ends when corruption ends and we return to perfection. So the circle closes. Okay? Does that make sense? The same with the Bible, where we start out in the Garden of Eden, and then we are corrupted, and we are forced out of the Garden of Eden, right? But nowhere does it say we'll return to the Garden of Eden. But when we reach Christianity, that's what will happen. Jesus is a promise of the return to the Garden of Eden. Okay? So now the circle closes. Does that make sense? Okay, any more questions? Okay. All right. Let's continue. So we have this religion, Zoroastrianism, and eventually the Jews will adopt it into their own religion. Okay? And we have Cyrus the Great, who is this wise, generous, and merciful leader. Okay? But he is this way because he is strategic. Okay? He's strategic. So, when he allows the Jews to return to Jerusalem, he's doing so for strategic purposes. Okay? He's not doing it because he feels sorry for the Jews. He's doing it because there's a certain strategic purpose in allowing them to return to Jerusalem. And the reason why is Jerusalem, the Levant, as we discussed, it is very important geographically. It marks access into Egypt, which is what Cyrus the Great eventually wants to conquer, because Egypt is the wealthiest nation in the world at this time. So he needs to bring stability to the Levant. And in the Persian worldview, what creates stability is the balancing of forces within the local area. Okay? So he needs to create conflict in the Levant. At this point in the Levant, there are still Israelites living there. And they are now called the Samaritans. Okay? And then you have the Jews. Okay? The Jews is a Persian word. It means people who live in the province of Judea, which is a Persian province. Okay? So they're called Jews now, and not Israelites. Israelites are now called Samaritans. These come from the same people. Okay? But the difference is this. The Israelites who stay have adapted to new circumstances. And so what this means is they still practice their religion, but they've also intermarried with women of different faiths. So now it's common for a household to practice many different faiths. Whereas the Jews in Babylon, they're more fanatical. They believe it's important to practice only one faith. So when Cyrus the Great sends the Jews back to the Levant, this immediately creates conflict between the Samaritans, who believe they are the true descendants of the Israelites, and the Jews, who believe they are the true descendants of the Israelites. So this creates religious conflict in the Levant, which means the Persians are able to become the arbiter. Okay? And this creates divide and rule. Now, what's important for us to understand is the Jews who return to the Samaritans are only the most fanatical Jews, okay? There's only a minority of people. The rest of the Jews are perfectly happy in Mesopotamia. They have very successful careers as administrators, as intellectuals, as teachers. They're happy where they are, okay? So it's only the most religious extremists who return. And they are in the minority. So the Samaritans are in the majority. So the Persians support the Jews who've returned in trying to create purity, okay? So the Jews argue for purity. The Samaritans argue for tolerance. And so this is a power struggle, a religious power struggle. In 443 BCE, around then, a priest, a Jewish priest named Ezra, he returns to Jerusalem, and he's determined to win this war. Okay? So there are certain things he does. The first thing he does that is extremely controversial is he announces, if you are a Jewish man, you must divorce a foreign woman. If you're married to a foreign woman, meaning a woman who doesn't share our faith, then you must divorce her in order to maintain the purity of our people. Okay? He also announces that from now on, it is mandatory for a Jewish man to observe religious rituals, to go to the temple and make your sacrifice. Okay, so he's trying to establish purity. But his main contribution, which is the most important, is he wants to unify the Jewish people into one faction, okay? So let me explain why this is important. So as we discussed, there are multiple Bibles out there, okay? And so there's at least 4 different schools or 4 different strands. There is the House of David school called the Yahwists, right? The Yahwists, or J. Remember, this is the idea of the Yahwists that Yahweh, he is a fallible, good-meaning, well-meaning poet. Okay? But the main point of the Yahwists is God has chosen David to be the legitimate ruler of Israel. God has also ordained David to build the temple where God will reside. Okay? So this is to legitimize the authority of David and to make people understand the central authority of this religion is the temple in Jerusalem. But as we discussed, eventually the northern kingdom will break away from Judah. But once you break away, you can't access Jerusalem anymore. So now you have to have other sites where you can practice your religious rituals, okay? But you do that, you have to change the Yahweh manuscript. And so they do that and create new mythologies, and this is what's called the E manuscript, okay? For Elohis. Elohis is just a different word for God. Right? Does that make sense? So you have 2 competing Bibles. At the same time, you have the priestly manuals. Okay, so remember, Judaism at this point, it is a religion focused on ritual, like most religions. So you need manuals in order to tell you why you're doing these rituals and how you should do these rituals. They have to be very precise. They are to be effective, okay? At the same time, as the northern kingdom fell, as Judah was conquered by the Babylonians, as the Jews are forced into captivity, you have to explain why this is happening, okay? And while this is happening, most people choose to not follow religion anymore, okay? They adopt a new religion or they move somewhere else, okay? But the religious fanatics have to explain why this is happening. And their explanation is because the Israelites continue to disobey God. And this faction, which is basically looking at Jewish history and explaining what is happening, is called the Deuteronomists, okay, the D school, the Deuteronomists. Okay, so these are 4 major factions, okay? Do you understand? And these are 4 different Bibles. Now what Israel wants to do is put all these 4 Bibles together to create the impression of a unified religion and a unified people. And the way he does that, which is very interesting, is he basically just takes different parts from each of these books and puts them together, okay? And now this is the Bible. And that's why if you actually read the Bible, you'll find it completely unreadable. Okay? But he also makes changes to the Bible, which is very important. Remember, before, the most important person was David, okay? Because he's really the founder of the nation of Israel. He's the founder of religion. Now, the most important person is Moses, because Moses is a priest. He is the one who was given the laws by Yahweh. Okay, so there are other changes as well, but this is the most important. Okay? There are other changes that will come over time as Zoroastrianism merges into Judaism. Okay? So there are 3 major changes. The first is the idea of eschatology. Okay? Meaning there will be an endpoint to history. And the end point of history is when the entire world, when all the empires of the world, because they defy God, converge against the nation of Israel in one final battle. Okay? And in this battle, of course, Israel will win, and this will create eternal peace in the world. Because God has chosen Israel as his people. Second big idea is good versus evil. Okay? Before, the religion of Judaism was very personal. Good and evil was in you. But now there is actually good and evil. Okay? Israel stands for good. These other nations, these other empires, like the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans, they represent evil. Okay? And the third change, and which is the most important, is there will be a hero who will come to lead the nation of Israel against all its enemies, and he is called the Messiah, the Son of Man. Okay, the Son of Man. And he will come from the house of David, as written in the Bible. Okay? And why is this important? Because the Christians believe their Messiah is Jesus. Okay? So the Christians basically take all this merger of Zoroastrianism with Judaism, and their claim is the Messiah is Jesus. Okay? And this creates Christianity.